So let's move on to section 2. Section 2 is where are we heading? So this is the section about the science. And I want to say, firstly, I am not a research scientist. I'm a software engineer. But this is the conclusions of my research I've done for giving presentations on this. I've tried to put where the quotes are from, where the numbers and statistics are from, so you can look at them yourself. I have missed the numerous places, I'm sure. Please do your own research. It's not an enjoyable thing to do, but if you do see any corrections, actually, please do contact us. I'll put the email address in the description. Contact Christian Climate Action Cambridge. That would be really helpful. Thank you very much. So we're going to cover the climate catastrophe and the ecological emergency. So I'll get started. So United Nations in 2018 said that we have 12 years to limit the climate catastrophe. They got that from a statement by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I read the executive summary of this report. It is not a final pretty read. The executive summary is quite easily consumable. It's not short, but it's a conglomerate of basically the whole field of climate science at the moment, and it was brought together to answer the question: how much worse is average temperature rise of the planet of 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial average temperatures compared to 1.5 degrees? We're currently at 1 degree, so this is only another half a degree. That's the differences this is talking about. Looking at the report, the names of the people that put this report together and reviewed this report are some of the most ridiculous CVs you may ever read. These people are not beginner scientists. This is the peak of climate science that put this together. And one of their major statements was, we must aim to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C to limit the climate change catastrophe. That 2 degrees is terrible. They're saying that 1.5 degrees is a catastrophe. Any higher than that is unbearable, and we must stop it at that. They said that extra 0.5 degrees will cause up to about 500 million more people in poverty. They said to limit it to 1.5 degrees would require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented change in all aspects of society. That's individuals, that's workplaces, that's our churches, that's our councils, all of our systems, our services, our government, everything needs to change, and not a small amount of change, but unprecedented change, huge change. We've seen that we can, as a world, change very rapidly in a crisis, the COVID crisis, of course. We never thought possible a year ago. No one would have ever expected this to be achievable. But we have shown that we can react in a crisis. We can make unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. That is literally what has happened. Far-reaching, rapid, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. We can do it. It said it would take us using 45% less CO2 by 2030 globally. And it talks about the concept of equity, which speaks of the injustice of climate change, of how it's the rich nations, including our own here in the UK, that caused the greatest effect, had the greatest impact, and will suffer slightly later than many other countries. And because of this, the equity is that we, being the rich countries in the world, the more economically developed countries, we can and must invest and make changes first, because we have a larger ability to. We have more fiscal assets to help us achieve this change. Whereas other countries that are going to suffer first and were far less liable for the destruction that has happened. Many of these countries don't have the fiscal assets to make the change necessary, and many are suffering already. We need to make that first change so the change for the others is easier and cheaper, because that's how technology works. You get some investing early on, which takes a lot of investment, and it then becomes cheaper as it moves out into mass usage. That's what the UN, through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has has spoken about. I'm sure that's something we can all resonate with as Christians. The ex-executive director of the UN Environmental Programme said that it's like a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put the fire out. So some of you may have seen this graph. This shows the extent of Arctic sea ice. I believe this is the graph from the report. It shows how in the end of summer, when the sea ice is at its minimum, when it's shrunk back in the Arctic to its minimum amount, how much coverage there is, and it shows the amount drop as the temperature increases. The black line is its mean prediction from all the models that you use to predict this, and then there's the ranges of its predictions. This red line, as it states, is the observations of what's actually happening. And as you can see, the observations are actually far worse than even their worst range of predictions. I'm showing you this to show that the IPCC's predictions aren't out there. They're not crazy. They're not ridiculous. Going off this, they're actually very conservative. That's double their range of their average prediction. This is very common in the models and the research, that things are happening faster and earlier than we ever expected them to. So I need to talk about two things: feedback loops and cascading tipping points. So firstly, I'll talk about feedback loops. This is from Yale Climate Connections. They say that climate change is not simply a matter of cause and effect, but it's more like a vicious cycle that gets, worse and worse and worse and feeds into itself to speed up the decline. So one example of this is the melting Arctic summer sea ice. What we showed in the graph before, the reasons why it actually happens faster. You need two facts to understand in this: the fact that sea ice reflects 50 to 70% of solar radiation. So when the sun comes and hits the sea ice, then the sheets of sea ice, then the majority of the energy from solar radiation reflects off and goes back out into space. But when the sea ice isn't there and it's just the sea, then that only reflects 6%. So 94% is retained instead of 30 to 50% when it's the sea ice. The feedback loop that this causes is, as temperatures rise, the sea ice melts more, which exposes more of the sea. Then the dark ocean water absorbs more of the heat, which traps the heat inside our atmosphere, which increases the temperature, which causes the sea ice to melt more, which causes more ocean to be exposed, which retains more heat, which causes the temperature to rise, which causes the ice to melt faster. And you see the idea of a feedback loop that feeds back into itself and gets faster and faster and is self-sustaining. Let's look at a second feedback loop. This is deforestation. So deforestation releases massive amounts of CO2 that is stored in the trees, and they can no longer act as a sink for carbon in photosynthesis as they change CO2 into oxygen. This doesn't happen, obviously, if they no longer exist, which means there's still more CO2 in the atmosphere. And as temperatures rise, then there are more forest fires, and forest fires are more frequent, and they are larger, which obviously then releases a whole load of CO2 into the atmosphere, and those trees are no longer absorbing CO2 and converting it into oxygen. So that raises the temperature because of the extra CO2 in the atmosphere, which then means there are more forest fires, which means they're no longer CO2 sinks, which means they release a load of CO2, which means there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, which causes temperatures to rise, which causes a vicious cycle that goes on and on. So here's some facts about deforestation. As a planet, we apparently lose the same area as UK and Ireland of forest coverage every year. That accounts for approximately 1 billion tons of CO2 every year, which is the potential to provide a third of global emission cuts needed by 2030. I think for the UK, we're currently at the level of 15% of the coverage that the UK had before human settlement. I think worldwide, we're down to 45% of the coverage that we had pre-humans. and it is dropping quickly. So why is there so much deforestation? According to the World Resources Institute, many of the reasons are clearing for soy and beef, palm oil and timber and other globally traded commodities. Interestingly, a lot of the soy is grown for the beef to eat. They say that much of the clearing is illegal and linked to corruption, which is partially why there are apparently 4 people every week that die for protesting against deforestation. A lot of natives to areas. That's how dangerous it is. And being a climate journalist is the second most deadly form of journalism after being on the front line in wars. There are lots of powers that don't want this information going around. There are lots of people that make a huge amount of money out of this sort of thing and that will do a lot to stop people getting in the way. According to Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the World Bank, 91% of the Amazon deforested since 1970 has been converted to cattle ranching. So that's where a lot of the Amazon is going. But moving on to tipping points. This is an analogy to help us understand tipping points. It's like a boulder rolling down a hill. It goes from one balanced position, one stable state. Like any ecosystem left on its own, it comes to a balanced state. And then when things start to change, for example, increase in temperature starts to happen, then it's like this boulder going from this flat place and starting to roll down a hill. The further it starts to roll down the hill and change, it will speed up and continue until it starts to plateau at a new stable state. The thing is, we don't know what these new stable states are. These systems that are breaking down have been the same for huge amounts of time. So we don't know what this new state is going to be, where things will start to plateau. But in the meantime, that also could take hundreds, thousands of years to happen. Another analogy, it's like when you're in a boat and you can rock the boat, and then you get to a point where you rock the boat a little bit too much, and then suddenly it starts to keep going, and the momentum of it pulls itself and it brings on water, and then it's gone. And the new stable state is filled with water or upside down. It tips to a new stable state. And there's a point where it can keep tipping and you can pull it back, but it gets to a point where you can't. The same with this boulder. When it's on the flat, it's easy going down the hill. The hill's only a bit steep, then it's easier to pull back and to try and reverse the change that's been made. But as it goes further down the hill, the ball gets momentum, the change happens faster. Being able to change it back to its previous state becomes harder. Here are a few tipping points. So we've mentioned Arctic summer sea ice. There are lots here. We'll talk about Greenland sheet ice later, and permafrost, a few other ice sheets, coral reef. We've spoken a bit about the Amazon rainforest, El Nido event, the jet stream. There are lots here. This is their approximations of when the tipping points might be. So for some of them, it's between 1 degree and 3 degrees. We are currently at 1 degree, and we've actually been seeing some of them happening already. We don't know when the tipping points where they can't come back and will start to just continue move to their new state is, but it's not looking hopeful for many of them. The Greenland sheet ice, even the amount that we've lost at the moment, would take huge amounts of time to come back. The amount of devastation we've caused on the coral reef, probably the same. But we're going to look at Greenland and Antarctica ice sheets melting. According to the IPCC, their suggested tipping point is between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. The interesting part about these ice sheets is they're not sea ice like we mentioned before. So sea ice, when it's in the water, you only see a small amount above the water. More of it is below the water, and the volume of water that it displaces, because some of it's above, when it melts, it actually takes up that same volume. So you don't get any sea level rise with ice sheets in the sea. But when it's on land, like on Greenland and Antarctica, where the ice is on the land and then it melts and then goes into the sea, that does raise sea levels. Between 1992 and 2017, the European Environmental Agency said that we lost 260 billion tons of the ice sheets every year. And this is another thing that is getting faster. It's predicted to cause between 0.5 meter and 2 meters of sea level rise before the end of the century, and then several meters after that. This isn't all the ice above ground, this is some of it. And every new report shows that it is happening faster than expected or predicted. Melting permafrost. So I didn't know what permafrost was before doing this sort of research, but permafrost is, in some places in the world, it's cold enough that under the ground, there's areas that are constantly frozen. There's permanently frozen, permafrost. And then on top of that, there's a layer that freezes and thaws every year, which is called the active layer. In this permafrost is stored a huge amount of methane. Apparently 1.8 trillion tons of methane is stored in permafrost. All of the numbers so far have been in billions of tons. This is 1.8 trillion tons. For comparison, that's double the current amount of atmospheric CO2. So the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere in the world at the moment, the entire globe, that amount of CO2, if you doubled that, that was how much methane would be released from the permafrost. And methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. It doesn't last as long. CO2 lasts, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but I think it's about 100 years, a half-life of CO2, and 8 years for methane. It's far shorter, but far more potent. It would cause an incredible, very sudden temperature spike, which would then cause more permafrost to melt because of the temperature spike, which would get more methane out in the atmosphere. It's another feedback loop, and it's also another tipping point because it would go from a state where there is methane stored in this permafrost to there being no permafrost. The world would look completely different. The melting permafrost would be one of the most devastating things that could possibly happen. Back to the raising sea levels that we spoke about. This would contribute to mass migration that would happen because of coastal and lowland flooding, which actually Cambridgeshire, especially North Cambridgeshire, is quite early on the list to have very frequent floods because we are so low. The UK has a lot of flood protection already. There is already work to counteract even more rising levels, but even those that are doing it are saying that it is not enough. The flooding of the coast and lowland will mean that people in those areas won't be able to live in those areas, so will move from those areas. And at the same time, central parts of continents will likely get too hot for humans to live, grow food, and be there at all. And also the destruction from extreme weather events, so the people in those areas will move as well. So these areas that are flooded and these areas that are too hot will have exoduses from them, and the remaining areas would have mass migration into them. It's predicted that there will be up to 1 billion climate migrants by 2050. 200 times the Syrian refugee crisis. An eighth of the world's population. These numbers are from the Institute for the Environment and Human Security from the United Nations University. Another thing that the IPCC's report speaks about, the numbers it uses are relying on technology that isn't proven at scale. So many people dissolve responsibility and dissolve us having to do anything, or dissolve trying to persuade anybody or really any need to talk about it because technology will save us. This report isn't saying these are the predictions if we don't do anything. These are the predictions if the technology that we currently have, and even some we don't, will be at scale and effective at scale and will work. One of those technologies that is largely touted is direct air carbon capture. Even the carbon removal expert at the World Resources Institute says it is unproven at the scale that we'll need it. It might not be able to scale like that. And the cost will be about $100 to $200 per ton of CO2. So, for example, a return flight in an economy seat from London to Hong Kong would cost between £300 and £600 to actually take the carbon out of the atmosphere with this technology. Those are the costs when they are scaled, and those are the costs that are touted as great selling points from carbonengineering.com/our technology under affordability. It is obviously not an affordable solution. It is a necessary extra. We still have to do it. That's what the IPCC is saying. We need to take direct action to drop our CO2 emissions, as well as putting huge amounts of money into technology to capture it as well. But the main problems with relying on these are there's only rich countries can afford them, especially at these prices. That is what they expect to be the prices at scale. So if we rely on that to get to our CO2 budget, then we're not actually making any system change. We're not investing in technology to reduce our CO2, just to capture it. We're not investing in making other technologies cheaper and more affordable for other countries that can't afford to do this. We're not helping anybody if we rely on it. Too many people touting it. We should be working in technology instead of making change, making sacrifices. Now, PCC say this is an and, not an or. There are many other things in the IPCC report that I have no time to go into detail for, but ocean acidification, expansion of desert terrain or desertification. They say that 90% of the coral reef will be destroyed at 1.5 degrees, and at 2 degrees, there will be total destruction of the coral reefs all over the world. They talk about the socio-economic crisis that will happen along with this. They say there'll be more vector-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue fever around the world. They talk about undernutrition, basically mass famine, as less of the world becomes the correct climate to produce food. So the amount of food we produce goes down as the amount of people we have increases, basically causing mass starvation. They also say there'll be high levels of public unrest and political destabilization due to increased climate pressures, resulting in countries becoming dysfunctional. There's many, many more things they talk about. This one of people's reactions. People will do horrific things. Even in the Bible, it talks of people eating their own children. And that's not just an ancient Bible story. That has happened in Europe not too long ago. The stories say the good die first because they won't eat other people. That's how bad humans can get. We like to live in this bubble where those aren't experiences that humans have, but the reality is they are when put under extreme measures. People will look for extreme solutions. So political destabilization, that's coups, dictatorships, extremism. These are valid predictions, like it's logical conclusions of where this will go when people don't have food, when people's homes are being destroyed. People get desperate. People will do all sorts of things to survive. These two researchers from the National Academy of Sciences in 2017 wrote that there is a 1 in 20 chance of existential threat to human existence. That's saying we could die as a race. They say that an increase of 1.5 degrees C is dangerous. Anything above 3 degrees is catastrophic. And anything above 5 degrees is completely unknown, implying beyond catastrophic, including existential threats to human existence. One of the people from that paper said, to put it in perspective, how many of us would choose to buckle our grandchildren into an airplane seat if we knew they had as much as 1 in 20 chance of the plane crashing? Obviously, we wouldn't do that. Imagine that for a moment. If you heard this journey had a 1 in 20 chance of them dying, you just wouldn't put your grandchild on that plane, would you? And the same with climate change. We have already put them on that plane. That's the current situation. So this is Dr. McNutt. She said that even the most positive predictions are dire. So there's another problem that doesn't get as much publicity and has equal, maybe more of a threat to human life. It's the ecological emergency. This has got some questions. Try and think of the answers if you can. This is back from when I gave it in public and people could answer. What world event happened on the 22nd of August? It was a thing called Earth Overshoot Day. This talks about our ecological footprint as a human population. Things like the carbon emissions that we produce and that balance against what the planet's natural ecosystem can absorb. The biomass, the massive biological things that are destroyed through things like deforestation, that nature can actually regrow the depleted fishing grounds, soil erosion, biodiversity loss, these things against the rate that nature replenishes them. It's the point in the year which we've used up the same amount of resources that the planet can replenish. And if you record that, this year was the 22nd of August for the world, which is actually a drop because of the COVID crisis. As life goes back to normal, hopefully not completely normal, but some level of new normal, this will likely go back up. But last year, as you can see, it was before August. But this year, we would need 1.6 planets to sustain the amount of resources that we are using. But when you think it was for the UK, I'll give you a clue. It was 16th of some month in the year. So it was August for the whole planet. It was May for the UK this year. So that's with a dramatic drop from the COVID crisis. It would take 2 2/3 Earths to sustain us if everybody in the world lived like UK citizens do. Last year, it was the 15th of April, leaving us at needing 3.5 whole planets if the human population all lived like the residents of the UK. 3.5 Earths. We're using resources 3.5 times faster than the world can replenish them. So, next question. How much faster are insects going extinct than all other life? How many times faster are insects going extinct than all other life? What do you think for that? It's apparently 8 times faster. So insects are going extinct 8 times faster than other life. It's a loss of 25% of all insects every year for the last 25 years. So since 1995, half of all insects have disappeared in 25 years. In less than my lifetime, 50% of all insects on the planet have gone. Why are insects important? Many of us know that insects pollinate plants. Obviously, if no plants get pollinated, we get no more plants. We also get no fruit. We get nothing that eats the plants, not just us, but other animals. The insects are also very early in the chain of life for other animals. So you have small insects that are eaten by things like mice and birds, and then those things are eaten by bigger animals, and we eat some of those animals. So insects are very, very important. Without the insects, that chain of life dies. Plants die. Things that rely on eating those plants die. So how many times faster than what's understood as being normal are species currently going extinct? It's a hard number to get, but the most conservative numbers I could find were 100 times. Animals are going extinct 100 times faster than what is normal. That's the most conservative you can produce. Most are saying probably 1,000 to 10,000. So somewhere between 100 and 10,000 times. That's how many times faster species are going extinct. So this is an extinction, but what percentage of animals with spines do you think have been wiped out since 1970? Since my dad left home? 60%. 60% of all animals with a spine have gone. We're now down to 40% of birds, fish, large animals, even including things like cows and chickens that we farm. We still have 60% less animals on this planet than we had before. So to put that into a human perspective, that's the equivalent of killing the entire population of North America, South America, Africa, Europe, China, and Oceania. If all of those places, every single person living in them had died in the last 50 years, if this happened, we would mourn every day. What a horrific incident that would be. But most people don't even know about this. I didn't know about this. The truth of the matter is, God knows every bird in the mountain and the insects in the field are his. This isn't just some random things that are dying. This is God's earth. The things that he cares about, that he made, that we're destroying. I know every bird in the mountain, and the insects in the fields are mine. I'm going to pause. I'll give you 1 minute to consider and to process.